Hey everyone, I'm Kate Kennedy and I'm here with day 47 of 100 Days of Kane, PA. And for the last 2 days, we have heard stories about the tornado of 1985. And today is the final day of stories just about that day. So we thought we would talk with Fire Chief Tim Holt, who was a firefighter at that time, who was actually up at the fire station when the tornado hit, and how the fire station responded and what some of the leaders in the town did to make sure that there was a great recovery here in Kane. The stories are really interesting and fascinating, and we really appreciate everyone sharing so far. And so I'm going to go ahead and flip you around and continue to hear the stories for today. So here we are at the fire station. Hello, Fire Chief Holt.
Hi, Kate. How are you today?
Good. How are you doing today?
Fine, thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us about the tornado in 1985 today. But before we begin with those stories, let's go ahead and talk about you. So you are from Kane originally?
Yes, I was born and raised in Kane down on Walnut Street, and I went to the West Side School originally and played sports in high school and graduated from here.
What year did you graduate high school?
1977.
And what did you do after graduation?
Right after graduation, I had enlisted in the U.S. Coast Guard, and I did 4 years in there. And then I returned back to Kane and married my wife in 1982, the same year I joined the fire department.
Okay. All right, so you've been with the fire department since 1982. And how long have you been fire chief?
8 years.
Okay, and when you first started here, who was the fire chief?
Joe Stauffer was the fire chief in Kane at the time of the tornado.
Okay, so let's talk about that day. What happened on that day from your perspective and in your memory?
Well, that day was a very hot and humid day in Kane, and started having some storms in the area, and they were warning of us of some storms. And my wife was going out of town that night, and after she left, I was going to do some household work, and I decided to come up to the fire hall instead because the weather conditions and everything. I thought somebody might need a basement pumped, or my tree might come down or something like that. So I swung by here, and there were some other guys here that night, and we were just sitting here waiting when it came through.
So who were some of the other guys that were up here that night that you remember?
Joe was here, Joe Stauffer, who was the fire chief at the time, Wendell Swedenjem, one of our deceased members, and Ron Anderson, he's also a deceased member, was here. There were several other guys here that night too. Randy Gulliver, who also lost his home in a tornado, had also stopped here.
So you guys were just sitting up here kind of anticipating that there might be a call because of the weather, but never expecting that a tornado would actually come through.
That is correct.
All right, so you're sitting here, the weather's starting to turn. What did you notice? What did you see or hear, or how did that go down?
Well, we had the first bay door open, and we were sitting there in some folding chairs, and we were just kind of talking, and we noticed some things were starting to fall out of the sky, leaves and different types of things like that. And we heard a rumbling sound. It sounded like something like a locomotive, only much louder and much deeper. And we had never experienced that before, but Wendy Swedenjem had been in the Army, and he was out in Kansas for a while and had experienced tornadoes, and he yelled, "That's a tornado." And we didn't know where to go in the building. I started backing up. I was going to jump under a truck. Ron Anderson ran into the radio room and hit the alarm and made an announcement, got a partial announcement out about a tornado coming through town. And one of our other members, I remember hearing the story that Don Blint lived on Biddle Street, and he was just getting ready to leave his house and heard the first part of that and stopped, and he actually saw the tornado going up the valley there at paralleled Hemlock.
So he was out on Biddle Street. He hears this partial announcement come through saying that there's a tornado, and it gets cut off.
Yeah.
And he's standing outside, and he actually then sees the tornado come through. Oh my goodness.
And that's the way I understand the story went. So.
Okay, so you guys are up here. The call goes out, then the tornado hits.
Correct.
Where were you then when the tornado actually came through?
We were still in the fire hall, and we had realized initially it looked like it was coming right at us, but it was just like some of the side winds and stuff. So it was really down in the valley, that parallels Hemlock Avenue. And once we realized that, it passed pretty quick. It wasn't like a long, drawn-out event. So we got organized, and I went out with Joe in his vehicle. We started making an assessment over here on the west side. We headed down towards Hemlock and that. And there were some other people around. Tom Brinkley was an assistant chief back then, and he worked at Kane Handle. He was the evening supervisor up there. And he got out in his vehicle and started making some assessments too. I mean, everybody knew something bad had happened. It was pretty obvious. And then we started getting the different calls and getting organized, and firemen started showing up here at the fire station, getting the equipment out. And at some point, they'd obviously called for mutual aid from other departments. And it was just a matter of making that assessment. And I remember coming up by the park with Joe, and Steve German was a police officer in Kane at the time still. And he had his safety vest on and his hat. He was off duty, and he was directing traffic at Greaves and Fraley, directing people away from going down into the areas that were impacted. And it was pouring down rain, and he was out there doing that. He showed a lot of dedication on his part.
Yeah. And so the fire station is a place that's kind of like the hub of emergency response. And did you guys have like a tornado plan at that point in time, or?
No, not really. I don't think there was any plan. We just kind of handled whatever came along, and
right, because there's never really.
Right.
I mean, the last tornado that had gone through had been decades and decades before.
Right.
So, yeah. So you kind of just had to act on your feet.
And we didn't have Doppler radar or anything like that in
Sure.
those days to make reference. So you just really were taken off guard by it.
So who kind of led all of the directions?
Well, Joe, being the fire chief, was the overall, what we would refer to today as the incident commander, and he did an outstanding job. Now, obviously, his first assistant, Tom Brinkley, did a great job too, and a lot of other people. There were a lot of truck officers and stuff. There was just so many people that played a role, but Joe showed a lot of leadership. Mayor James stepped in. He got out of town, I know, and he made some phone calls to help get some additional resources here. I was always amazed at the fact that we live in a community with all the loggers and everything that we do, that they were able to go out and they retrieved their skidders and different equipment from the woods, came back into town to help clear the streets. It was just an all-out effort on a lot of people. A lot of people contributed to it.
Yeah, and there were firefighters. You guys are volunteers.
Correct.
So you have full-time jobs, work in other places.
Right.
How did that work with the recovery?
Well, Joe's company eventually let him he tried to go back to work that following week, and it just wasn't working out because there were so many responsibilities. And to the best of my knowledge, his company let him off with pay so he could see to his community. Sierra Mag at the time, there was a lot of firefighters that worked at Sierra Mag, and they let all their firefighters that were workers there off with pay for at least a week to
That's
help
amazing.
with it was tremendous.
And so the firefighters and community volunteers and people from other communities, what were you doing in that week's time to help the community?
Well, I think I didn't have much to do with that at that point because of my own loss in my home and everything, but I know those guys were continually going around and cutting trees up and helping people with certain issues with their homes and everything like that. There was a lot of work that was going on. There wasn't any power in the community for quite some time. So they were assisting in any way they could, with the resources and different equipment that we had to help that cause.
And then even going around probably the night of and the next morning trying to assess for injuries, because you guys do that as well. You probably had to be pretty resourceful because I'm sure there weren't a lot of ambulances available.
Right, and there was a situation where a lady was injured, and some neighbors and people going by helped load her onto a door and carry her to an ambulance all the way at the end of Laurel Avenue down where South Fraley crosses. And it was just the amount of resources it takes to respond to something like that. It doesn't take long to use that resource up. So people were getting pretty resourceful as far as doing things like that.
Right, and the ambulances probably couldn't even get up to some of the areas with the blockage, and so you had to do things like use a door as a backboard, which I think is really, you just use what you have in situations like that. So you were mentioning that you had a loss. So you're here at the fire station the night of the tornado. You're going around making sure people are okay, and you knew your wife was out of town, so you knew she
Correct.
was safe. So the last thing you were thinking about was your own home, huh?
That's correct. And finally, somebody mentioned something about it, and I hadn't put two and two together yet. And somebody said, maybe you better go check your own property. That's when I made my way up there, and that's when I discovered that our house had been blown away in the tornado.
So you were newly married still, married in 1982. This is
Correct.
1985. How old were you?
I must have been, I think I was 25, maybe 26.
So in your mid-20s, and you just go to your house,
Yeah.
and it's gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, what were you thinking and feeling?
Well, I think you're in kind of shock. We'd been through quite a bit already that night, seeing the devastation and everything. And I remember my nephew, who had graduated from high school that year, Jody Blomquist, he came up just as I had got there and said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I guess I'm going to have to build a new house. You need to start over." So
Yeah.
that's what we ended up doing.
Okay, yeah, and we're going to look at pictures of that in a minute. But before we look at the pictures, one other aspect that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting was that the schools were affected by the tornado. It was the last day of school, but the actual buildings had been damaged.
Right.
And so could you talk a little bit about the rebuilding of that and what you think of that?
Yeah, I think Vern Johnson's leadership in putting that all together, because you have to remember that they only had 3 months to get things up and running again when school was going to start again. And the junior high school and the high school sustained significant damage. And I think his leadership and just the way he rolled up his sleeves and tore into that and guided the district through that, I think is pretty remarkable. It's part of his legacy. I think it's kind of been understated over the years. Same with Mayor James and Joe Stauffer. I think what they did during that tornado and the aftermath, I think, is pretty significant in our history and the leadership they all showed.
They just responded and they just did what needed to be done.
Exactly.
Yeah,
As a lot of people did. And I'm sure there's other folks too that I'm just not aware of, but
right. But those are three of the leaders that
that's what I think.
that really made an impact on you.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead. Here at the fire station, you guys have pictures of the tornado on the wall. Would you mind taking us through some of those photos and talking about what they are? Because your house
Sure.
is there, the school is there. We'll walk over.
Well, we've had this hanging up here for quite a few years. This is down at the end of Pine Street. Houston Electronics had sustained some damage because it's in the valley where the tornado came up through. And this is some of my neighborhood here and my neighbors' homes. And this was some more Pennsylvania Avenue. That happened to be my basement. That's what I had left there.
Wow. So this is what you walked up to see, that
Yeah.
your home was really, really gone.
It was interesting that night because the atmosphere had cleared and the moon came out. It was almost like a full moon and you could see real well. And the temperature dropped significantly also. And it was kind of eerie standing there looking at all that. But
Yeah, right.
we got through it. And this is Laurel Avenue, which is kind of like behind my home where I live. A lot of the damage down through there. And then as you go into the upper right corner, you can see the Kane Area Junior High School, and the windows were all knocked out. Just sustained real heavy damage.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the windows are all gone.
And then the East Kane, and they had a lot of devastation down there, and the East Kane Methodist Church, which was totally knocked down.
Wow. Yeah.
So
That
there's
is-
you could see why when we responded that initially that night, you had no way of knowing how much it had gone through the entire area until you start getting other reports out from people getting out. And our communication back then in those days, we didn't have cell phones. Our radio communication we didn't have the volume that we have today of portable radios and different things. So putting all that together and forming a response and checking buildings and making sure that people were out and back in those days too, I think you have to remember a Friday night, that's when everybody used to go out for supper and go shopping and everything. So I think the fact that it hit at the time that it did, there was a lot of those people weren't home, and I think that prevented the loss of more life than what we had lost, unfortunately.
And we did have, like you said, good leadership. Even
Yeah.
though a tornado wasn't something any of them had ever experienced before, people just stepped up and took the lead and really took action.
Yeah, they did. There's a lot of people took roles, and neighbors helping neighbors and everything. It was a big deal, and it makes you proud to be from here.
Yeah.
Small town.
Yeah, really got back on our feet.
Yep, and it was fast. I think the recovery was a lot faster than people anticipated too.
Yeah. Well, this is great. This is a really interesting perspective. I really appreciated hearing your experience being here at the fire station when the tornado came through. Is there anything else that you wanted to share that you didn't get a chance to?
I don't think so. I think that pretty much covered it. But
All right. Well, thank you so much for
Yeah.
your time today.
all right, thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in and hearing about the perspective and the stories from the fire station on the night of the tornado. It was really great to hear about the leadership of different members of our community, and there were many more leaders, I'm sure, that weren't mentioned as Tim referenced, but the leadership of the fire chief at the time, Joe Stauffer, Mayor Jesse James, and Superintendent Vern Johnson really taken some action and leadership to help rebuild the town alongside of the neighbors and the churches and the other people here that really just jumped in and got things going right away. So who do you remember taking leadership or really helping you out during the time of the recovery from the tornado? Please comment below. We'd love to hear your stories. Thanks again for tuning in today, and we'll be back again tomorrow for day 48.